modernity, as if a billion people were really only one person, and Western civilization was no more complicated a matter than a simple declarative sentence. But what I do want to stress is, first of all, how Huntington has picked up from Lewis in a classical kind of Orientalist gesture the notion that civilizations are monolithic and homogeneous. And second, how, again from Lewis, he assumes the unchanging character of the duality between us and them. In other words, I think it's absolutely imperative to stress that, like Lewis, Huntington doesn't write neutral, descriptive, and objective prose, but is himself a polemicist whose rhetoric not only depends heavily on prior arguments about a war of all against all, but in effect perpetuates them. Far from being an arbiter between civilizations, which is what he suggests he might be doing, Huntington is a partisan, an advocate of one civilization over all the others. Like Lewis, Huntington defines Islamic civilization reductively, as if what most matters about it is its supposed anti-Westernism. I mean, it doesn't matter to him that Muslims have other things to do than to think about the West with hatred. But you get the impression that that's all they're thinking about, is how to destroy the West, bomb it, and, destroy the whole world, really. For his part, Lewis tries to give a set of reasons for his definition that Islam has never modernized, that it never separated between church and state, that it has been incapable of understanding other civilization, all of them, complete untruths. I mean, of course, the Arabs, the Muslims have traveled well before the Europeans in the East, in Africa, and in Europe, and were great discoverers of other civilization well before Marco Polo and Columbus. But Huntington doesn't bother with any of this. For him, Islam, Confucianism, and the other 5 or 6 civilizations, Hindu, Japanese, Slavic Orthodox, Latin American, and African, that still exist, are separate from each other, and consequently potentially in a conflict which he wants to manage, not resolve. He writes, therefore, as a crisis manager, not as a student of cultures and civilizations, nor as a reconciler between them. At the core, and this is what has made his work strike so responsive a chord among post-Cold War policymakers, is this sense that you saw in crisis managing prose during the Vietnam War, this sense of cutting through a lot of unnecessary details. You go through masses of scholarship and huge amounts of experience, and you boil all of it down to a couple of catchy, easy to quote and remember ideas, which are then passed off as pragmatic, hard-headed, practical, sensible, clear. But is this, and now I come to the more serious part of what I have to say, is this the best way to understand the world we live in? Is it wise to produce a simplified map of the world and then hand it to generals and civilian lawmakers as a prescription for first comprehending and then acting in the world? Doesn't this, in effect, prolong and deepen conflict? What does it do to minimize civilizational conflict? Do we want the clash of civilizations? Doesn't it mobilize nationalist passions and therefore nationalist murderousness? Shouldn't we be asking the question, why is one doing this sort of thing? To understand or to act? To mitigate or to aggravate the likelihood of conflict? I'd want to begin to survey the world situation by commenting on how prevalent it has become for people to speak now in the name of large and, in my opinion, undesirably vague and manipulable abstractions like the West, or Japanese culture, or Slavic culture, or Islam, or Confucianism, labels that collapse particular religions, races, and ethnicities into ideologies that are considerably more unpleasant and provocative than Gobineau and Renan did 150 years ago. Let me give a couple of examples to illustrate what I mean. The language of group identity makes a particularly strident appearance from the middle to the end of the 19th century as the culmination of decades of international competition between the great European and American powers for territories in Africa and Asia. In the battle for the empty spaces of Africa, the so-called Dark Continent, France and Britain, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, resort not only to force, but to a whole slew of theories and rhetorics for justifying their plunder. Perhaps the most famous of such devices is the French notion of the civilizing mission, la mission civilisatrice, a notion underlying which is the idea that some races and cultures have a higher aim in life than others. This gives the more powerful, the more developed, the more civilized, the higher, the right to colonize others, not in the name of brute force or plunder, both of which are standard components of the exercise, but in the name of a noble ideal. Conrad's most famous story, The Heart of Darkness, is an ironic, even terrifying enactment of this thesis that, as the narrator puts it, the conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. What redeems it is the idea. An idea at the back of it, not a sentimental pretense, but an idea, and an unselfish belief in the idea, something you can bow down before and sacrifice to. In response to this sort of logic, two things occur. One is that competing imperial powers invent their own theory of cultural destiny in order to justify their actions abroad. Britain had such a theory, Germany had one, Belgium had one, and of course in the concept of manifest destiny, the United States had one too. These redeeming ideas dignify the practice of competition and clash, whose real purpose, as Conrad quite accurately saw, was self-aggrandizement, power, conquest, treasure, and unrestrained self-pride. I'd go so far as to say that what we today call the politics or the rhetoric of identity, by which a member of one ethnic or religious or national or cultural group puts that group at the center of the world, derives from that period of imperial competition at the end of the last century. And this in turn provokes the concept of worlds at war that quite obviously is at the heart of Huntington's article. In the related fields of political economy, geography, anthropology, and historiography, the theory that each world is self-enclosed, has its own boundaries and special territory, is applied to the world map, to the structure of civilizations, to the notion that each race has a special destiny, a psychology, and an ethos. Renan said, for example, that the Chinese race, its destiny is to serve. They are a docile people and they must serve. The black race must be the bearers, the laborers of mankind, because they're strong in physique and can work hard. That kind of. All of these ideas, almost without exception, are based not on the harmony, but on the clash or conflict between worlds. The second thing that happens is that the lesser peoples, the objects of the imperial gaze, so to speak, respond by resisting their forcible manipulation and settlement. We now know that active resistance to the white man began the moment he set foot in places like Algeria, East Africa, India, and elsewhere. Later, primary resistance was succeeded by secondary resistance, the organization of political and cultural movements determined to achieve independence and liberation from imperial control. At precisely the moment in the 19th century that among the European and American powers a rhetoric of cultural self-justification begins to be widespread, a responding rhetoric among the colonized people develops, one that speaks in terms of African or Asian or Arab or Muslim unity, independence, self-determination. In India, for example, the Congress Party was organized in 1880 and by the turn of the century had convinced the Indian elite that only by supporting Indian languages, industry, and commerce could political freedom come. These are ours and ours alone, runs the argument, and only by supporting our world against theirs, note the us versus them construction, can we finally stand on our own. One finds a similar logic at work during the Meiji period in modern Japan. Something like this rhetoric of belonging is also lodged at the heart of each independence movement's nationalism. And it achieved the result shortly after World War II, not only of dismantling over a period of about 20 years the classical empires, but of winning independence for dozens of countries thereafter. India, Indonesia, most of the Arab countries, Indochina, Algeria, Kenya, etc. All these emerged onto the world scene, sometimes peacefully, sometimes as the effect of internal developments, as in the Japanese instance, or of ugly colonial wars and wars of national liberation. In both the colonial and post-colonial context, therefore, rhetorics of general cultural or civilizational specificity went in two potential directions. One, a utopian line that insisted on an overall pattern of integration and harmony between all peoples. The other, a line that suggested as to how all cultures were so specific and jealous as to reject and war against all the others. Among instances of the utopian are the language and institutions